Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I am Julia Ruther, Program Manager for Impact and Collective Giving at the Minneapolis Foundation, and I am joined by my friend Allison from Propel Nonprofits.
Hi, I'm Allison Wagstrom. I'm a Senior Loan Officer and Financial Management Specialist at Propel Nonprofits.
Today, we are going to talk about how to approach conversations about and assessments of nonprofit finances through the lens of curiosity, not scrutiny. And we're going to talk about why this distinction is meaningful to the resiliency of the nonprofit sector. In Minnesota, the ice surge has added to financial stresses in the nonprofit sector, recently compounded by COVID, by the civil unrest of 2020, and most recently by dramatic changes to federal policy and funding. This current context has clarified that to survive and thrive, nonprofits need nimble, responsive, strong, or communities need nimble, responsive, and strong nonprofits providing accessible resources and services. So how do we get there? Well, a strong nonprofit sector requires supporters, donors, leaders, and funders who are similarly nimble, stable, and responsive to changing contexts. It's reciprocal. Our time together this morning has been designed to be a learning space. So what that means is showing up imperfectly, being receptive to perspectives that might kind of unsettle your sense of knowing and deepen your sense of what's possible. So Allison, thank you for being with us today. And thanks to each of you for signing up and showing up. It takes a village to produce a webinar like this. And so thank you to my colleagues at the Minneapolis Foundation and to Propel Nonprofits for helping to put together this learning event. So before we kick off, I want to share a few important housekeeping notes. First, the agenda is really divided into 4 parts. So the first part is Allison and I in dialogue. Then we are going to have some small group discussions. So you've been warned. There will be breakout rooms that these conversations are going to be facilitated by one of our staff colleagues. And then we'll all be brought back into the space for some group conversation, full group conversation. And then Allison and I will close us out briefly. You have likely noticed, but we are recording this webinar. All of the full webinar is being recorded except for those breakout rooms. What we share with folks afterwards who aren't able to be here live will be edited, so it's just the pieces where Allison and I are talking, not anything that's shared by the group in the room. So for this first section, the dialogue between Allison and I, we just ask that you please stay muted, and then there'll be opportunity after that to come off mute, come on camera, and engage with each other. So before we jump in with both feet, I'd like to share some good news, bad news. First, the bad news. In Minnesota, fraudulent use of federal funds by individuals, organizations, and for-profit entities has been confirmed in the social services sector. This has been used as a vehicle for misinformation and really vilification of the nonprofit sector. It's eroding what has already been a really fragile trust in civil society. The good news is that the Minneapolis Foundation, we believe that, we do not believe there's widespread financial fraud in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits are embedded in the daily lives of Americans and Minnesotans, playing really vital roles in everything from healthcare to food access, the arts, and beyond. So, there are real threats to the stability of this sector, but widespread financial fraud in the nonprofit sector, it just really isn't one of them. So this is rare good news, and we really hope that you'll share that. So in that vein, nonprofits are facing historic challenges, right? We are seeing dramatic increases in the needs for services, as well as decreases in funding. Dramatically for government funding, but also shifts in philanthropic dollars. We're seeing reports from Minnesota Council on Nonprofits sharing that more than 80% of nonprofits are reporting increases in needs for their services since January of 2025. And then the Center of Effective Philanthropy, a national organization, has reported just in January that nearly 70% of nonprofits are reporting reduction in funding from at least one key funding source. So, Allison, can you break down how this current context differs from the other recent disruptions that the sectors and communities have faced?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to explain that this is a continuum. So there is difference, but there is a lot of overlapping layering going on that's resulting in nonprofits in the current state that they are. So what's different specifically right now is when you look at the type of funding that nonprofits have, one of the main funders that was historically very reliable, has become unreliable. And that kind of change in the business model of many nonprofits results in uncertainty. And that uncertainty results in organizations needing to make specific reactions. I want to be clear. I do not believe nonprofits are overreacting. I think they are reacting appropriately to the situation in which they have found themselves. And fundamentally, they are doing the work of meeting the needs of their clients while balancing the needs of financial realities that they're facing. Overall, I think as an organization, an organizational culture space, we really are going to see some nonprofits that are probably going to look at mergers. They're probably going to look at potential sunsettings. We will see that. That is a normal part of the nonprofit life cycle, but it might feel more sudden to you that that's happening, less so because it's always treated with, we always feel like the loss of a nonprofit is detrimental, and I agree. And also, sunsetting is a normal part of this, and we should be prepared to see that.
Absolutely. I think we're also really should be expecting and are already seeing organizations that are cutting staff, right? Shifting and reducing programming, as well as, putting sort of strategic plans or expansion plans on hold, correct, reactive to all the disruption currently.
Yeah, it's when you are in a space and you are experiencing uncertainty, one of the best things you try to do is to find the things you can hold on to and really focus in on those. So what leaders are doing is finding the relationships that are strongest and relying on those. They're finding the funders and the people who support them individually, who they can be honest with about the increase of services and what that does to a nonprofit. Specifically in health and human service, in the ICE occupation, they had to completely change their business models overnight. We had food shelves that were walk-in food shelves shifting to deliver food to people in their homes, and that is a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
So what we see and value in this time is really those unrestricted gifts that allowed organizations to be nimble and flexible and meet the needs of the community where they are. Now we're talking about what do we do long term in order to ensure that our nonprofit sector continues to be the bright shining star that it is for not Minnesota, and also be curious and hold accountable the things we need to talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we're just seeing a moment in which, differing from previous disruptions, we're not seeing an influx in government funding like we had seen before, but in fact, it's actually really the opposite of that. So really having to shift differently than even in sort of recent times?
I really think nonprofit leaders are excellent change agents. I think they do the work of many hands to meet the needs of many individuals.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, something I've been struck by in recent years is how kind of understood nonprofit revenue sources are, right? There's a lot of really smart people and lots of great data, but there's also sort of myths and misinformations, and as always with money, feelings about the sector's financing. So can you talk about or really kind of break down the big three revenue types for the sectors and maybe, bust a myth about each of them?
Bust a myth. Okay, so the first is earned revenue, which is where services are delivered and then they are paid for by either governmental funding or individual pay or an insurance. The largest revenue source for nonprofits is actually earned revenue, but when you remove hospitals and universities, that number changes. So if you think about the way in which you read a lot of stories about like major gifts and major earned revenue, that is really skewed by our hospitals and our universities. In terms of a $3 to $50 million nonprofit, they're really balancing between philanthropic dollars, individual donors, and governmental funds. They also are using, for many of them, an earned revenue stream.
Yeah.
And for governmental funds, historically, it used to be that it was hard to get them originally, but if you did a good job, you could actually find yourself with some stable government funding. This was especially helpful in securing our unhoused population work and food shelves. In addition, with governmental funds, there was a relationship that could be built and an understanding that the policy was going to stay the way it was. Unfortunately, we have seen a change in the policy of governmental funding, and that has upturned many nonprofits' abilities to be successful. We have seen nonprofits close. We have seen nonprofits struggle because of the instability in government funding. So what does that mean for the other types of funding? Well, first of all, it doesn't mean that they can fill that gap. That's just not something we believe is possible. But what it does mean is we need to be thinking about the ways in which we can meet the challenges nonprofits are facing while keeping our eye on who we serve. And we do that through individual donations and philanthropic grants. And we do that through earned revenue. Those are the three main stuff. And when it comes to philanthropic grants, we really are interested in seeing organizations work with their partners to ensure that they are having the type of relationship that allows them to move forward.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing, as we talk about sort of nimble funding and flexible funding, what I find really important to understand and what has been really detrimental to the sector is the reverse of that, right? Which is restrictive funding. We see it, I think, most powerfully or constrictedly in government, right? There's a lot of steps and a lot of reporting, and that's long been a challenge in an otherwise stable funding source. But can you just say something about like what restrictive funding often looks like in practice?
Yeah, so gifts are fantastic, and I have been grateful every time I've received a gift. Programmatic funding has a role and a place. What it doesn't do is provide organizational flexibility and nimbility to meet the challenges of things that have happened in the last 6 months.
Right.
So you end up having to draw from other sources of money while protecting that restricted fund. And while that restricted fund can be given in one year, you often have to spend it in the next year, which also results in deficits on income statements, which can be confusing to approach. If they receive $200,000, why are they running a deficit the next year? Well, because of the way accounting works, You have to account for the whole amount in the very beginning, and then next year spend that money.
Absolutely.
Not to
So
get too accounting on
I was going
everybody.
to say, so just administratively from an accounting perspective to an actual financial management perspective, the more specific a gift is saying, yes, you can use it for this, this, and this, right, becomes really cumbersome for nonprofits to manage. So I think looking at, philanthropy spaces, there's often a few kind of key documents, whether you're in the position of receiving funds or giving funds, donating funds, that these financial documents are kind of part of that, like, for your consideration package, right? So it's the IRS 990, an organizational budget, and a balance sheet. These are often used as, with good intention, sort of instruments for like scrutiny, like what is their financial position, when really they could be used as like relationship building tools, right? So could you orient us to how best use these financial documents?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the 990, which is an amazing document to learn about nonprofits. It's required for all nonprofits in the United States to submit a 990. In that 990, you're going to find program information. You're going to find information about the organization's leadership structure, its board of directors, and its programs. In addition, you're going to see financial information. And the key part to remember is that 990s are historical. Everything that's happened is in the past, and there is little to nothing that a nonprofit can do to change what has happened. It's an important document to ground you in the health of an organization long term, but keep in mind that 990s are often 6 to 9 months past the year end that they're reporting on. So they are not necessarily a current snapshot. That's where the balance sheet comes in. Looking at a balance sheet gives you an ability to understand what's going on with cash, receivables, and also with the liabilities that the organization carries. And I think the balance sheet is one of the most underused documents in understanding nonprofit financials. I use it all the time. It is absolutely a guiding post for me, and I encourage people to use a balance sheet to get grounded in what balance sheets mean. Finally, the organizational budget is forward-looking, and that can help you understand what is going on and what are the plans for the year ahead. And I really think the organizational budget is where the curiosity and the conversations come out.
Absolutely. And really what I have found and encourage donors to really do is think about when you start digging into those documents, right? The moment to build relationships is when you're in relationships. So really lead with your heart with your first gift to a nonprofit and say, like, I care about what this organization is doing, so I'm going to give to them. Start to get to know the people, build relationships, and start talking about like their business model, how they operate. And that's really when those financial documents come into play. So now that we've had a kind of refresher and grounding on the fundamental financial documents, what are meaningful financial indicators to pay attention to? Like, what might financial stability look like on the page?
Yeah, the first thing to make sure you pay attention to is cash. Cash is a really important part of an organization's ability to be flexible and meet the challenges. You can find that on the balance sheet, and I always say a good understanding of an organizational cash position is absolutely a strong place to start. Whether or not they have reserves is a good indicator of their success. Things like operating reserves show that a nonprofit has the ability to weather storms that potentially other nonprofits don't. Now, if a nonprofit does not have a reserve, that is not a nonprofit that is failing. That is a nonprofit that is working towards developing that reserve and also struggling a little bit with the financial realities of running their programs. We see in health and human services some of the lowest amounts of reserves, not because they are not successful nonprofits, but because of their funding model with the government.
Right.
Government pays a price, but not the full cost.
Yeah.
And they have to underwrite much of that service.
And that's where that restrictive dollar comes in,
Correct.
right?
Correct. In addition, I think we need to talk about deficits. Was a deficit planned? Did the organization have temporarily restricted assets that they had to release in the previous year? And did that result in them having a deficit? Understanding what happened in a deficit year is one of the most rich conversations you can have to build relationship.
Totally.
And finally, I think looking for stability in the financials, you really have to look at those deficits and surpluses year over year. What is happening for the organization year over year? And I want to be clear, we at Propel do not believe repeated deficits are a no-go. We are interested in why there are repeated deficits.
Mm-hmm.
And we often work with clients on how do you turn around a business model that is generating deficits. And so it's not a stop. It's not like I see a deficit and I stop. I see a deficit and I get curious.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important reminder, is that it's really that curiosity to just say, like, what's underneath this, rather than thinking about financial indicators in that sort of black and white, red flag kind of context, is thinking about sort of what's the gray and what's the kind of human story about what's happening inside the program delivery, to get curious with that. So I'd always say, like, that's the lean in moment to say, let's get curious about the deficit. And I think in that kind of myth busting context, when we see a reserve, right, again, on a balance sheet, I have often heard it myself thought sort of, gosh, do they have enough money, right? Do they need my donation? They seem to have a reserve. And I think it's so important to say, like, that reserve is an indicator of really strong leadership, really strong strategy, a wealth of supporters who believe in the work. And so what a great organization to continue to invest in the long term. So our last question here is, like, as we're emboldened with this knowledge, how can we translate this curiosity mindset in the financial space into action in our individual, or perhaps sort of like institutional funding space that we might find ourselves in? How can supporters help pave pathways to financial stability for nonprofits that they care about right now?
Well, first, understand that sustainability is not a destination, it's a way of living. And understand that going forward, organizations need to be focused on sustainability as one of their key indicators of success. But really, I would like to encourage people to consider general operating donations to nonprofits, specifically because that allows the organizational leader to make the determination of how to best meet the needs. And we're talking about people who have done this work for decades, leading their organizations effectively, delivering services for many, many years, and ensuring that those services are delivered at a high quality. I'd like to recommend a 2-year funding cycle where perhaps as a trial, you give a donation for 2 years. And what that does for the leader of that organization is it helps them plan strategically for the future. They know they're going to have that $10,000 gift next year. They know they're going to have that $50,000 gift next year. And what that does for them is it frees up the ability to be forward thinking and not overreactionary. It allows them to be nimble and successful. And finally, numbers aren't the whole story. Many, many nonprofits are experiencing financial instability. Many nonprofits are trying to figure out how to exist and deliver services that are desperately needed in our community. And what they need are partners, and what they need are people who are curious and also hold them accountable.
Absolutely. I feel like in the way that sort of strong nonprofits need that reciprocal strong supporter, I think we see the same thing here in saying, in the ways that we want sort of accountability from nonprofits, clarity from nonprofits. They need that too from their supporters. And that's, I think, where that 2-year, even just a 2-year commitment, that multi-year commitment, saying explicitly, I'm committed to this, is so powerful for the leaders of organizations to be able to really take a sigh, big sigh of relief, and then keep going.
And it also allows them the ability to go forward and say, other people are investing in us at this level.
Yes, yes.
And that is contagious.
Totally. I love that. Well, thank you, Allison. Allison, I'm going to turn to you to help really drive home maybe kind of like the 3 big takeaways for our time this morning.
I think the first thing is that context matters. And that really you can understand through relationships. Understanding the reason there might be deficits in the past and the context surrounding them, absolutely something to keep in mind. Secondarily, curiosity over scrutiny, approaching things with a light heart and an openness to the way in which things are operating for a nonprofit, and experiencing yourself as a collaborator with the leader and the rest of the people who are trying to deliver those services. And then finally, I'm just going to hit that 2-year unrestricted gift as a really transformational. I can speak from organizations I've been the finance director of, and the way the multi-year gifts have transformed those organizations.
I think as we close here, one thing that I would like to say and just kind of ground us back in again is that, as we have these conversations about financial precarity and talk about increases in demand for services, it's really important to remember that we're talking about people, and we're talking about the daily moment-to-moment experiences of people and families and children and our neighbors in our neighborhoods, for whom meals and housing and health and wellness and education and employment and recreation, right, is really fragile and tenuous. And also the people who show up in the nonprofits, work at the nonprofits every day to really create new circumstances, change the circumstances for our neighbors and for one another, really doing the work of making the possible, that's what's underneath financial documents and all of these indicators and things that we're talking about. And so I'll just offer to you all, again, my appreciation for you for showing up, because there will always be a moment, or there will be that moment where we are the caregivers, but also that moment where we're the care receivers. And so if you're ever wondering, if I do this thing differently, does it matter? I think the big takeaway in this kind of collective work that we're doing is that you matter. And I just want to offer that as closing. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, Allison. Thank you to the team here. It was really wonderful to see you all in the Zoom room. I look forward to seeing you hopefully at some other Minneapolis Foundation event sometime soon.